The first snow of November hadn't even melted off the fence posts when Walt Pruitt walked out into his best bottomland field with a shovel over his shoulder and started digging. Not a ditch for irrigation, not a trench for pipe, just long curving channels that wound through 11 acres of the richest corn ground in the county, cutting across rows his father had planted the same way for 40 years. By the second week, half the town had heard about it. "He's cutting up the Pruitt bottoms," Earl Higby said at the feed store, shaking his head like he was reporting a death. "Best dirt this side of the river, and the man's turning it into a swamp." Nobody could explain why. Walt didn't explain either. He just kept digging, morning after morning, breath fogging in the cold, boots sinking into half-frozen mud, while his neighbors slowed their trucks along the county road to stare. His daughter, Rennie, drove up from 3 towns over the day she heard, marched straight out into the field in her church shoes, and stood in front of him with her arms crossed. "Dad, that's 40 acres of income you're digging into a ditch." 11, he said, not looking up. "That's not the point." He straightened, wiped his forehead with the back of a gloved hand, and looked at her the way he used to when she was 12, and asking questions she wasn't ready to hear the answers to. "Your grandfather dug something just like this once," he said, "before your time, before the levee went in, and I filled it back in, 40 years ago. Best decision I thought I ever made." He picked the shovel back up. "Now, I'm not so sure." That was all he'd give her. Rennie drove home more worried than when she'd arrived, and worried she was learning was a feeling that didn't fade with distance. If you enjoy stories like this one, about ordinary people who see something the rest of the world doesn't, and quietly keep going anyway, you might want to stay close because this one only gets stranger from here. By December, the channels connected into shapes nobody in town could quite make sense of. Not straight, not random, curved in ways that seemed to follow some old logic only Walt remembered. By January, he'd started something even harder to explain. Planting willow whips along the low curves, driving them into frozen ground one at a time, always at the same sharp angle, always facing the same direction. Patient as a man with nowhere else to be. 11 acres of good cropland turned into a willow patch, Earl told anyone who'd listen at Sunday coffee. Man's grieving Ruth Pruitt and taking it out on his own dirt. He wasn't entirely wrong about the grief. Ruth had been gone 3 years that spring, and something in Walt had gone quiet, the way a house goes quiet after the second person leaves it. But grief wasn't the whole answer, and anyone who bothered to ask instead of laugh might have sensed there was a second reason underneath the first. One Walt kept folded away like a letter he wasn't ready to read aloud. His grandson Cole was the only one who asked. Cole was 11, all elbows and questions, and he found Walt out there most Saturdays, kneeling in the mud, pressing willow stakes into the earth, like he was tucking something in for the night. "Why 45 degrees?" Cole asked one gray afternoon. "Why not straight up?" Walt looked at him for a long moment like the question had more weight than an 11-year-old could know. "Ask me again in the spring," he said. "Hand me that next one." He never finished the thought. He rarely finished any of them that winter, not for Cole, not for Rennie, not for the county inspector who came by in February asking why a registered floodplain parcel had suddenly sprouted unauthorized earthworks. Walt showed the man the channels, answered what he had to, and offered nothing more, which only deepened the questions the man drove away with. Spring came late and hard. Snowmelt filled the channels fast, and for one uneasy week in April, water stood high along the curves, brown and restless, climbing higher than Cole had ever seen it. Twice it crept close enough to the willow roots that Walt walked the banks at first light with his jaw set tight, saying nothing, measuring something only he understood. The water went down eventually. Nobody could say exactly why or where it had gone, or whether the channels had done anything at all, besides hold their ground for one more season. Walt didn't explain that either. He only nodded once, quietly, like a man checking off part of a promise nobody else knew he'd made. What would you have done, standing where Walt stood, certain of something nobody else could see, watching your own family start to doubt you? Would you have kept digging, or would you have filled it back in, the way he did 40 years before? Summer brought harder costs. The grain co-op dropped his contract outright after the buyer drove out and found willow saplings instead of a plantable 11 acres, telling Walt flatly that a man digging up productive ground wasn't one he could count on for a steady harvest. The loss cut deep enough that Walt sold 2 head of cattle just to cover seed and fencing costs elsewhere on the farm. The feed store started asking for payment up front. His old tractor needed a part the county supplier no longer stocked, and he drove 90 minutes each way twice that July just to keep it running. The county drainage board came out again in August, this time with a formal notice: restore the channels to original grade within the year, or face a fine. Walt folded the letter into his shirt pocket and said nothing to Rennie about it for 3 full weeks. She found out anyway, the way daughters do, and drove up that August evening more frightened than angry. "Dad, they can force you to fill it in. You could lose the fine fighting it. Lose the land fighting it. What are you even protecting?" "Something your grandfather understood better than I did," he said. "I just haven't earned the right to say it out loud yet." She didn't understand what that meant. Neither did Cole, who'd started keeping a notebook of his own that summer. One small observation a week: water levels, willow growth, the shape of the current after a hard rain, without telling anyone why, except that his grandfather had once said the land keeps better records than people do, if you're patient enough to read them. Late that August, Earl Higbee did something he never mentioned to another living soul until long after. He drove out past Walt's fence line after dark, alone, and walked the channels by a flashlight, measuring the curve of them with an old surveyor's tape he still had from his army days. He stood at the low end for a long while, listening to water move slower than it had any right to, and drove home without telling Walt he'd been there at all. He came back twice more before September, always after dark, always alone. And once he asked Cole, carefully like the question cost him something, whether his grandfather had ever said what those channels were built to hold back. Cole just shrugged, the way his grandfather had taught him without meaning to, and said, "Ask me again in the spring." Autumn came dry and still, the kind of stillness old farmers distrust without knowing exactly why. Walt watched the sky more than his fields that October. He'd started sleeping poorly, Rennie noticed. The fine from the county still unpaid, the fight over the land still unresolved. And more than once she heard him out at the channels well after dark, walking the willow line alone, checking roots that had barely had 2 seasons to take hold. If a story like this one is doing something for you tonight, if you believe patience and quiet attention still matter more than they get credit for, this is exactly the moment to hit like. Because what happened to Walt next would test every bit of that patience. The storm arrived the 2nd week of November, a full year after Walt had first picked up his shovel. Rain that didn't stop for 4 days, then snow on top of it, then rain again, until the river 2 miles north swelled past anything the old levee had been built to hold. The first surge hit Walt's land before dawn on the 3rd day, and for a long, terrible hour, It looked like every warning anyone had given him was about to come true. Water overtopped the low end of the channels entirely, tearing loose a stretch of the young willow bank Cole had measured all summer. And Rennie, standing beside her father in the freezing dark, said the only thing she could think to say. "Dad, I think it's failing." Walt didn't answer at first. He stood in the rain with his flashlight shaking in his hand, watching water do something he hadn't accounted for. And for the first time in a year, doubt crossed his face where his family could see it. "Maybe I remembered it wrong," he said. "Quite enough." That only Rennie heard. Maybe 40 years was too long to trust an old man's memory. But the channels held beneath the overtopped water, even as the surface looked like ruin. The curves he dug weren't meant to stop the flood at the edge. They were built to take it in, spread it wide, and let it sink, the way his grandfather had shown him on that same ground, before Walt himself had filled it in, and trusted a levee instead. It simply took the full weight of the river to prove it. And by first light, while the levee 2 miles north gave way entirely and swallowed half the county's cropland whole, Walt's 11 acres were doing exactly what they had been built generations ago to do, moving water instead of fighting it, sinking it instead of shedding it. The willows bending but holding, roots laced deep enough now to keep the banks from washing out from under them. Earl Higby's cattle, driven off his flooding land in the panic before dawn, ended up standing belly-deep but alive on the one rise of solid ground, left standing for a mile around, the raised berm Walt had built with the dirt from his own channels, without ever mentioning why. By the second morning, half the town had gathered at the edge of Walt's land, watching floodwater move calm and slow through the willows while it raged everywhere else. Nobody was laughing now. Rennie stood beside her father in rubber boots, silent, the fear of the night before still on her face, watching the ground do exactly what he'd never quite managed to promise her it would. "Your grandfather knew this ground floods," Walt finally said, to her and to Cole both. "He built for it. I forgot that lesson the day I filled his channels back in and trusted a levee instead. Took me 40 years, one fine I couldn't pay, and one storm that nearly proved me wrong before it proved me right, to remember he'd been right the whole time. What came after the water receded mattered as much as the flood itself. The county rescinded the fine within the week, and the same inspector who'd once handed Walt a violation notice spent an entire afternoon walking the channels beside him, taking notes for reasons that had changed completely. Earl Higby, whose cattle had survived on Walt's berm, finally admitted where he'd been those nights in August and spent that whole winter helping extend the channel system another 6 acres, hardly speaking of it, the way men do when gratitude runs too deep for easy words between them. Cole's notebook didn't stay his alone for long. His teacher, Mrs. Aldrich, asked to see it that winter, then asked if he'd stand up and explain it to the class, water levels and willow growth and all. And by spring, the county extension office was using pieces of it to teach 2 other townships what Walt had spent a year relearning the hard way. 2 farms along the river started their own channels that same season, willows going into the ground the same patient way, 45 degrees, roots pointed downstream, a lesson passed on exactly as it had been passed to Walt and to his grandfather before him. Rennie still drives up most weekends. She doesn't bring her church shoes into the field anymore. Last winter, she brought a shovel of her own and stood beside her father in the mud, learning what he'd almost let the world talk him out of remembering, and what he'd almost, for one long hour in the rain, talked himself out of trusting. Walt doesn't say much about any of it, even now. He still walks his channels most evenings, watching the willows lean in the wind. And if you ask him what they are, He won't call them flood control, and he won't call them a farmer's regret undone. He'll tell you the land has a memory longer than any one man's, and that it only ever speaks to the people patient enough to kneel down and listen. The way his grandfather once knelt, the way he finally knelt again, the way Cole kneels now without needing to be told twice. The willows were never simply trees. The channels were never simply ditches. They became, in the end, the one place where an entire county's forgotten memory still stood rooted in the ground, waiting quietly for the next flood and the next generation to prove it right all over again. If you've made it this far, you already know the kind of story this channel is built on. The quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the people the world laughs at, right up until the moment the land itself proves them right. If that's the kind of story you want more of, stick around and subscribe, because there are plenty more like Walt's still waiting to be told.